What if the building you call church, the one with the steeple, the pews, the Sunday service, what if the very first Christians would have looked at it and had absolutely no idea what it was? Not because they were primitive, not because they were uneducated, but because to them, the entire concept of a dedicated worship building was something they associated with one group of people: pagans. That's the claim. And before you dismiss it, give me a few minutes, because the historical record on this is surprisingly clear. Here's something most people never learn in church. For roughly the first 200 years of Christianity's existence, Christians did not build churches. Not a single dedicated worship structure. None. Historians across the board largely agree on this. The earliest known purpose-built Christian church building dates to around 230 to 240 AD, found at Dura-Europos in modern-day Syria. That's more than 2 centuries after the resurrection. 200 years of Christianity with no church buildings whatsoever. Now, the question almost everyone asks at this point is obvious. Why? Were they too poor? Were they hiding from Roman persecution? Those are reasonable guesses, but the historical evidence points to something far more interesting. They didn't build because they didn't think they were supposed to. Let's go back to the beginning. The very first followers of Jesus were Jewish, and Jews already had the temple in Jerusalem, the most magnificent house of worship in the ancient world. If any group understood the concept of a sacred building, it was them. But something shifted after the resurrection, dramatically. In the book of Acts, we see the earliest Christians meeting in homes, in open courtyards, by riversides, in rented halls. They weren't hiding. In Jerusalem, in the earliest days, they were publicly visible, growing in public favor. They simply did not gravitate toward constructing a sacred space. And when you read what these early believers actually wrote about themselves, a picture emerges that is genuinely surprising. They called themselves a nation, God's holy nation. That phrase comes directly from one of their earliest letters, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. They weren't primarily thinking of themselves as a religious group that gathered weekly for a worship service. They were thinking of themselves as a people, a community, a civilization in midst of other civilizations. That distinction matters more than it might seem. So if they weren't gathering for worship services, what were they actually doing when they came together? This is where it gets fascinating. They had multiple kinds of gatherings, and they were remarkably different from what most people today would recognize as church. First, there was something called the love feast, agape in Greek. This was a shared meal, real food, real tables, real conversation. The Lord's Supper that many modern churches perform in a few solemn minutes was embedded inside this longer communal meal. Eating together wasn't a preliminary activity before the real event. The eating was the event. Second, they had what we might call community assemblies. These were decision-making gatherings. When a significant issue arose in the community, the people came together and worked it out collectively. Scholars who have studied early church governance note a remarkably participatory quality to these early assemblies. This wasn't a top-down institution yet. It functioned more like a direct democracy of people who genuinely knew and trusted each other. Third, there were teaching gatherings. These happened when a teacher arrived in town, someone who had traveled from another community with a message, a letter, or fresh instruction. These weren't standing weekly events. They were responsive, organic. It wasn't done every week, only when a teacher comes to town or one of them have a series of words from God. Now, across all of these gatherings, the physical setting was almost always the same: someone's home. Now let's talk about what happened inside those homes, because this part tends to blow people's minds. When they sang together, it wasn't primarily what we today would call worship music. It wasn't about expressing emotion toward God in the direction of a stage. Scholars studying early Christian hymnody, people like Everett Ferguson in his work on early church worship, note that much of the music served a catechetical function. That means it was teaching wrapped in melody. And think about why. In the 1st and 2nd century, almost no one owned a personal copy of any scripture. Scrolls were expensive, literacy was not universal. So how do you ensure that a community of ordinary people actually remembers the core beliefs and ethical commitments of their faith? You put it in a song. You sing about forgiveness, you sing about caring for the poor, you sing about how to treat your neighbor, how to handle conflict, how to live with integrity in a society that often had very different values. The music was a memory system, a portable curriculum. That context completely changes how you hear lines from Paul's letter to the Colossians, where he says to teach and admonish one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. He wasn't just describing an emotional experience, he was describing a teaching methodology. And now we arrive at the question that the first 60% of this video has been quietly building toward. How did all of this change? Because something clearly did change, dramatically. The Christianity most people encounter today is organized around a building, a weekly event, a professional clergy, and a concept of sacred space that would have been familiar to any pagan in the Roman Empire. How did a movement that refused to build worship structures become one of the world's largest builders of them? The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't a single decision made by a single person. It was a slow drift across several generations, a series of small accommodations and compromises. When the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century and eventually issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, granting Christians legal freedom, something significant happened. Christianity went from being a movement on the edges of power to being embraced by the center of power. Funding flowed in, imperial architecture followed. The basilica, which was a Roman public hall used for civic and legal functions, was repurposed into the Christian meeting space. And once you have a grand building, everything begins to reorganize itself around it. The gathering moves from the home to the hall. The participatory assembly gives way to a performance. The traveling teacher becomes a resident professional. The shared meal shrinks into a ritual. The community of people who gathered to be a nation together begins to look, structurally, remarkably like every other religious institution in the ancient world. Was this inevitable? Was it entirely wrong? Historians and theologians debate this with genuine passion. Some argue that institutionalization was necessary for the faith to survive and spread across centuries and cultures. Others argue that something essential was lost in the transformation. I am not saying nothing good came out of the institutional church. The same church that drifted from its early patterns also preserved ancient manuscripts, built hospitals, and produced reformers who kept pushing the faith back towards its roots. That history is real and it matters. But here's the honest question the evidence leaves us with. Is what most people today experience as church the same thing the earliest Christians were practicing? The historical record forces us to sit with the uncomfortable reality that the answer is probably no, at least not structurally. What you do with that answer, that's entirely up to you.